Hi, I'm Ted Nelson. A few weeks ago, at the Internet Archive, I met a man named Eyvind Rusak from the Norwegian National Library. And when I told him that I knew Agnar Mykle, he was astonished and wanted to hear all about it. So rather than just tell the story to him, I'll put it on YouTube and whoever is interested can find out. When I was 4 years old, I thought I was Norwegian. I lived in Chicago with my grandparents who raised me. My grandfather was named Theodore Home. This is the Norwegian spelling, Theodore Home. So I was wisely named after the man who was going to raise me since my parents were separated. And he was Norwegian. He'd come from Norway. And we had Norwegian flags around the house. And because Norway was at that time occupied by the Nazis in 1941, 42, 43, he was extremely concerned for his family in Norway. Now, my grandfather was raised at a place called Hallgrim. Hallgrim. Hall was the name of the town, the nearest location, and Gamle means old, and Prestegård is parsonage. His father, Karenos Theodore Home, was the country parson, which was at that time in the 1880s, 1890s, was at that time a government job. And so my great-grandfather, Karenos Theodore Home, gave sermons at the various churches around Hall. So you can look it up now, Hallgrim the Prestegård. It's now an art colony. So I visited it more than once, where my grandfather was born and grew up. Well, when the war ended, 1945, my grandfather immediately sent all kinds of food and cloth to Norway so they could begin to restore their lives. And in 1949, when I was 11, we sailed across to Norway, first to England and then to Norway. I was 12 when we got off the boat. I had my birthday in the middle of the Atlantic. And we went to a wedding celebration in Norway of all the Holm relatives at that time. It was the greatest gathering of that Holm clan, the descendants of Karenos Theodore Home, that ever happened. A wedding in June 1949. And Pop, my grandfather, was of course a great celebrity because of all the things he had sent over. Anyway, at that time I was very interested in puppets. I had been watching TV. Our neighbors, our neighbors in Manhattan, one of the neighbors had a big screen TV, and he gave me a key to his apartment, so I got to watch TV in the very early days. And I was especially interested in puppets. There was one called Fudini that I liked very much. And when I said I was interested in puppets to the Norwegians, they said, "Oh, you must meet Uncle Agnar. You must meet Agnar. He is a puppeteer." So they introduced me to Agnar Mykle. Now, Agnar Mykle, this is how it's spelled in Norwegian. Agnar Mykle. We would say in the United States Agnar Mykle, but it's Agnar Mykle. And he was very enthusiastic, effulgent guy. And we had an immediate connection. I was 12, he was 30-something. And he showed me his puppets, and they were satirical puppets representing figures of that time. I remember he even had one for Franco. He had them for Hitler and Mussolini and de Gaulle. And Franco, I'd never even heard of Franco at that time. And so we were pals at that moment. Well, we went back to New York, and I guess it was 3 years later in 51, when I was in 10th grade, Agnar writes to us and says he's coming to stay for 2 weeks. Well, my grandfather was rather disconcerted because he didn't ask, he just told us. He was going to, Agnar was going to go to University of North Carolina on a Fulbright. So Agnar stayed with us for a couple of weeks. We palled around some. I went with him once to the New York Times because he wanted a copy of one of their posters. We saw Guys and Dolls together. I remember when the line, "When you spot a John waiting out in the rain," and he said, "The John is a toilet, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes," not quite understanding the context. But at any rate, then he went to the University of North Carolina. He wrote a play called Sunset sunrise in yellow-orange, I'm not sure where. All the actors were supposed to be naked. They solved the problem by wearing fur coats, is my understanding. So then Agnar goes back to Norway. Well, sir. He then writes the book. Okay. Agnar wrote a book called Sangen om den röde Ruben, Song of the Red Ruby, which meant pussy. It was the naughtiest book that had ever been published in Norway. And I don't know the details, but he went to jail. There were parliamentary discussions. And finally, Norway abolished censorship. And that was the beginning of what is now referred to as the Scandinavian sexual revolution. Because then the Swedes produced movies like I'm Curious Yellow, which had nudity and shocked America. On a side note, the director Ingmar Bergman had a movie called Smiles of a Summer Night. When that was released in the United States, the distributors wanted additional nude scenes, so my friend Larry Moyer was hired to shoot additional nude scenes, which were put into Bergman's Smiles of a Summer Night. They were eventually taken out. So anyway, that was the main event in Agnar's life, that he became this great chronicler of, this great actor in the theater of censorship and the sexual revolution. Then what happened? Well, oh yes, I showed him, while he was staying with us, I showed him a short story I had written. I was at that time a science fiction fan, and my favorite science fiction writer was, guess who? L. Ron Hubbard. This was before Dianetics and before Scientology. I liked his stories. He wrote one called Fear that I thought was especially good, and I wrote a parody of it, or pardon me, a story kind of based on it. And he asked if he could use it. And I said, okay. And a few years later, a book came to us from Agnar in which he had put my story, but he put it in a special context where he referred to my mother, who was an actress, and he referred to her as, I'm sorry, word loss. Anyway, Pretty Poison, and indicated that the closing line of my short story, where demons are sitting around a fire and someone has a vision of his mother as somehow indicating my psychology. I don't think it did in that particular. So those are, so my grandfather was sour on Agnar after that. And the last I heard, I think it was 19, I wrote to get in touch with Agnar's publishers when I was in my 50s. And they said, he's waiting for your phone call. And I delayed, and then he died. So I didn't have that last conversation, which would have been very interesting. I did have lunch with Kristin Newgard. Kristin Newgard, the founder of, one of the two founders of object-oriented programming, who were Norwegians. And he said, oh yeah, I helped keep, so we talked about programming languages and whatnot, but not a whole lot. And he said, yes, I kept Norway out of the European Union because Norway has oil, and if oil prices go up, the euro goes down, so we didn't want to be correlated with them. And then he said something else very interesting. He said, oh yes, and I took Agnar's puppeteering course, and it's his wife, Jana. She was the smart one. That's Jana Holm spelt. Jana Holm. There was an interesting anecdote in the family where Agnar had shown up on the doorstep of his mother-in-law, Jana's mother, with another young lady to spend the night, and they were indignantly turned away, whereupon Jana indignantly called her mother and said, he's a writer, he's got to have these experiences. So, those are my Agnar stories. But I still think I'm Norwegian, because one thing about Norwegians, they laugh a lot, and they always say what they think, which has not always been beneficial in my experience.